Hello everyone, and welcome to a very special bonus surprise in the Trail Went Cold's feed today titled My Bloody Valentine. Now, you may remember that back in October, Shane Waters' The Foul Play podcast organized a special joint Halloween episode in which a bunch of different podcasters would each spend about 10 minutes talking about a spooky case. Well, we've organized another one of these joint efforts for Valentine's Day in which a number of different podcasters, including yours truly, talk about a Valentine's-themed case involving a love story gone horribly wrong. You'll find a list of all the participating podcasts in the show notes, and about an hour and 15 minutes into this thing, you'll hear me talk about the unsolved 1993 murder of Billy Trimbach. So without any further ado, I hope you enjoy My Bloody Valentine.
Oh, hey. It's good to see you. I'm Shane Waters, the host of Foul Play Crime Series. And tonight on this special Valentine's Day two-part episode, I'm going to ask you the age-old question, will you be my Valentine? If you find it agreeable, we will explore the history behind this romantic day, and 14 podcaster friends of mine will be joining us throughout our trip to share crime stories of love gone wrong. So, what do you say? Welcome to My Bloody Valentine. Here, let's take a seat in this restaurant. I had to make reservations way ahead of time to get us in. The atmosphere is really nice, the candle lighting and romantic music. While we wait for our food, and my first friend to show up with our first story, I'll fill you in on some details about Valentine's Day. It of course occurs every February 14th, and candy, flowers, and gifts are often exchanged in the name of St. Valentine. Now I really want some candy chocolates. Oh, hey, Kristen. Kristen is the host of Murder, She Told. I'll let you take it from here with our first story of the night.
The box was perfectly delightful, wrapped in brown paper with the prettiest pink satin ribbon. Mary Dunning wondered who would send her such a gift in the mail. There was no return address. The only clue was the smudged ink of the postmark, San Francisco. Mary was across the country in Dover, Delaware, but she had lived in the Golden City in years past. The pink satin slipped off, and beneath the wrapping was a box of chocolates. Pretty little dark-colored bonbons sitting on a brand new lace handkerchief. Somebody forgot to remove the tag, and Mary couldn't help but notice it came from the luxury department store City of Paris. Somebody wanted to spoil her. But who? Inside, there was a handwritten note that said simply, "With love to yourself and baby, Mrs. C." Mary assumed it was most likely a thoughtful surprise from her friend, Mrs. Corbally, who knew Mary adored candy. But Mary curbed the urge to spoil her appetite with a treat and decided to bring them to a dinner gathering later that night at her sister's home. 2 days later, on August 11, 1898, both Mary and her sister were dead, and 3 others from the party followed. All 5 had suffered a slow and agonizing death, hallucinations and delirium, severe stomach pains, and violent sickness. Household remedies had no effect. The doctors thought it was food poisoning, but curiously, not everyone from the party got sick, just the 5 who fancied the chocolate. Mary's father, who was a former congressman for Delaware, had a chemist analyze the chocolate and discovered that they contained a large amount of arsenic. Who poisoned the chocolates? Better yet, who sent them? And who was Mrs. C? The woman on the bench intrigued 32-year-old John Dunning. There was something magnetic about her. She was 41, a former vaudeville actress, and wasn't like the other women in San Francisco. She was fun, free, easy. She liked to gamble, drink, and hang out with the boys at the brothel. Her name was Cordelia Botkin, and despite the buttoned-up society lady's disdain for promiscuity, she knew the power she had over men. And Cordelia wanted John Dunning. It didn't take long before John and Cordelia were tangled up with one another, literally and physically. Both were married. Cordelia was separated from her husband, but John's wife, Mary, was oblivious to the affair. The adulterous duo commiserated over their partners and grew closer over late nights, booze, and gambling. John worked for the Associated Press as a seasoned reporter and often had assignments overseas. His long absences put stress on his marriage. Mary and John were only hanging on by a thread. But around 1895, when Mary found out about Cordelia, she ended it. Humiliated that apparently all of San Francisco knew about this affair except her, she left him to be with her family in Delaware. With Mary out of the picture, John and Cordelia were free to do as they pleased, but John had picked up some new habits: heavy drinking and gambling. He had racked up a huge gambling debt, so he stole $4,000, which is about $144,000 today, from his employer to pay it off. When the AP found out, they fired him. After about 3 years of love and lust, when the world was on the verge of the Spanish-American War, the AP hired him back. They needed a veteran reporter stationed in Cuba to cover it. This was John's wake-up call. He cut it off with Cordelia and told her that he wanted to get back with Mary after he returned. Cordelia was devastated. She begged him not to go, but he told her he would not be returning to San Francisco. While John was stationed in Cuba, Mary had been receiving handwritten letters in the mail from San Francisco from an anonymous author. They detailed John's sordid affairs around town with, quote, an extremely attractive woman, and the mystery writer urged Mary not to take John back. The letters sat in a drawer until after Mary's death, when her father discovered them during the investigation. John had returned to Delaware after learning what happened, and Mary's father confronted him with the letters. John admitted to everything the letter said, and he also recognized the handwriting. It was Cordelia's. When he was shown the note inside the chocolate box, he was stunned. It matched Cordelia's handwriting. His mistress had murdered his wife, and the 4 other people who had also died were innocent bystanders. Meanwhile, investigators in San Francisco identified the brown paper and pink ribbon as the signature wrapping of a local chocolatier, George Haas Confectionery. They spoke with a clerk who remembered an odd encounter with a short, stout woman with dark hair. He sold her half a box of candy, and she claimed that she was filling the rest of it with her own homemade chocolates. Police tracked down the post office clerk who accepted the package, the department store saleswoman who sold her the lace handkerchief, and finally, the drugstore clerk that sold her the arsenic. All 4 workers described a woman who looked like Cordelia. In her hotel room, police discovered leftover paper wrapping from the candy store, and Cordelia was arrested on murder charges. There was a legal argument about who had jurisdiction in this strange case. The victims had died in Delaware, but Cordelia sent the poisoned chocolate from California. But it was settled that the trial would be held in California in December of 1898, 4 months after the crime was committed. The media couldn't get enough of Cordelia Botkin and her scandalous lifestyle. This was the trial to end the century. She pled not guilty, and though she did admit to buying the arsenic, she insisted it was for cleaning purposes only. The jury disagreed, found her guilty, and sentenced her to life in prison. A year or so later, the judge from her trial spotted Cordelia out and about in San Francisco. He launched an investigation and discovered that she may or may not have been trading favors for privileges with the guards. When word got back to her about the investigation, she claimed that it wasn't her, but a lookalike, and that the judge was mistaken. While these shenanigans were unfolding, Cordelia's legal appeal, too, was playing out. The Supreme Court of California agreed with her attorneys that her trial judge had given improper jury instructions and overturned the ruling, sending it back to the DA if they wanted to try her again. After many delays, she was tried again and convicted again. And though 9 voted for her to be hanged, the jury had to be unanimous to impose the death penalty. So in 1904, she was sentenced once again to life in prison. Though not culpable in any legal way, John was the one who brought Cordelia into their lives and invited her wrath. If anyone, it was he who deserved her ire. But he escaped justice. He even got his job back, at least until the trial ruined what little reputation he had left. And what a tragedy it was that Mary's generosity with the chocolates condemned 4 others as well. Their deaths, too, were on John's head. Cordelia was an incorrigible hustler. She tap danced throughout her life, twisting and warping narratives to bend people to her will. But the iron bars and cinder block walls of San Quentin State Prison could not be cajoled. And after 10 years of incarceration, at the age of 56, Cordelia Botkin drew her last breath.
Carnivals are a popular place to go for a romantic getaway. Strolling down the aisles, playing the games to win prizes, and riding the rides. Like my all-time favorite, the Zipper. Here, I picked us up some cotton candy. Oh look, there's Cambo buying a corn dog. Cambo is the host of True Crime Island.
It's Valentine's Day 1994. 2 women are found dead in a burning massage parlour in Sydney. Grab a beer and pull up a deck chair. So, my Valentine's case is from 1994, Gladesville, Sydney, Australia. So usually Valentine's Day is where loving couples go and spend a load of cash, maybe book a fancy restaurant, give gifts or whatever. They usually don't order a hit on their significant other, but we'll get to that later. Now, firemen are called to 4 Flagstaff Street, Gladesville at around 7:30 p.m. on Valentine's Day. This is the location of Kerry's Oasis, a massage therapy business owned and run by 36-year-old Kerry Pang and her de facto husband, 57-year-old Mark Lewis. It wasn't the sort of place you'd go for a sports injury. It was more of a rub-and-tug happy ending massage parlour. Mark Lewis, he ran a similar place up the road at West Ryde. When the firemen gain entry to the burning building, they check one room and they find the dead body of a woman that would be identified as 25-year-old Fatima Ozanal, shot 3 times in the head. Further towards the back of the premises where the fire was burning was an office. Inside was a woman that they dragged out into the hallway thinking she may still be alive. But on closer inspection, she was already dead. She would be identified as the owner, Kerry Pang, and she had suffered 18 stab wounds to her head, neck and body, had been shot in the eye, and her throat had been slashed. The fire was extinguished and police called. Mark Lewis, he arrives at the scene from his massage parlour in West Ryde, and when he saw what was happening, he had to be restrained by police and firefighters from entering the building. He was screaming, "Oh, Kerry, Kerry," and he ended up collapsing. As is the procedure, Mark, being the de facto, would be interviewed by investigators about his movements that afternoon. Now, he tells police he called Kerry to come to his massage place to pick him up as he wasn't feeling well. Kerry did go and get him, but they ended up driving back in separate cars back to Kerry's Oasis. When there, he said he was going to leave his .22 caliber rifle, which was in the back of his van, at Kerry Oasis's office. But as they both reached the front door, he changed his mind and he put it back in his van. Then he drove back to his massage parlour. He also mentioned to investigators how he had received a call earlier that afternoon from a caller that said he was going to kill Kerry. Now, Lewis said he got back to his massage parlour at around 7 p.m. Now, police searched his car that he had on the night, the Tarago van, and indeed, they found a .22 caliber rifle in a rifle bag. Inside the bag were a couple of blood spots as well as some on the outside of the bag. Now, Mark Lewis's clothes were taken and his shorts also had a blood spot on them. Autopsies on the women showed they had been shot by .22 caliber rounds, and empty shell casings found on the site were also .22 caliber. Lewis's rifle was tested, but wasn't a match for the recovered rounds, nor were any of his other 7 rifles matched what was found at the scene. Now, one strange piece of evidence found at the scene was a small nose piece from a pair of spectacles. Now, when police checked out Mark's story, they found that most of it was probably true. The timeline, though, was out by about an hour, according to other witnesses and phone records. Now, this put him at the scene of the crime just before the firemen were called and when the women had probably been killed. But although the blood spots on the rifle bag and on Mark's shorts would match Kerry Pang, they lived and they worked together, so it really didn't hold that much weight. So the case sort of went cold. Even though they had suspicions about Mark Lewis, they didn't have enough evidence to charge him. Then just over a couple of years later, Lindsay Rose, a small-time crook, was drinking in a pub with a mate and happened to mention how he killed these women on Valentine's Day and had killed others. Now, Rose called himself the mechanic after the Charles Bronson 1972 movie where Charles plays the part of a hitman called the mechanic who wants to retire, but some young guy wants to learn the trade and becomes his apprentice. Lindsay Rose goes on to tell his mate he had an apprentice on the night called Donnie. Well, this mate at the pub was actually a police informant and tipped off investigators about what Rose had told him. Investigators found the apprentice Donnie, who immediately confessed and grassed out Rose. Donnie's name was actually Ron Waters, an out-of-work tattoo artist, and his story was that Lindsay Rose had approached him at the pub and asked if he could help him out, as he needed to talk to this woman at a massage joint, but if they saw him, they wouldn't let him in. Rose told him that all he had to do was knock on the door, and when they opened it, he would step in and talk to this woman. Rose offered Ron $500, which was big money back then, especially for an out-of-work tattoo artist. Ron said he and Rose went to Kerry's Oasis at around 7 p.m. Ron knocked on the door as planned, and it was opened by Fatima. Then Rose rushed in, silenced pistol in hand, and manhandled Fatima into one of the massage rooms, telling her if she did what he asked, she'd be fine. Then Ron shouted out to Rose, alerting him to the fact that he could see two people approach the entrance. As they were about to open the door, Rose put 3 rounds into Fatima's head and waited as the door opened. It was Kerry, and as she entered, Rose grabbed her and a struggle broke out. Kerry fighting as hard as she could, managing to hit Rose and break his spectacles, which landed on the ground. Behind her was Mark Lewis with a rifle. Now, Ron saw the gun immediately, and he lunged at Lewis, pinning him to the ground. Now, while still fighting with Kerry, Rose yells out to Ron, "Hey, that's the guy that's paying for the job." Now, Kerry ended up breaking free of Lindsay and tried to escape by running out to the back office. But this was in vain. Lindsay caught up with her. He stabbed her 18 times, shot her in the eye, and slashed her throat. He then set fire to the office and left with Ron in one car while Mark left to go back to his massage parlour in the van. Now, when police finally found Rose, they asked him about a 1984 double murder, and he confessed straight away. They then asked him about the murder of Kerry and Fatima, and again, he confessed immediately. Investigators had also gone around to optometrists in the area and had found Rose had dropped a pair of spectacles in for repair just after Valentine's Day in 1994. Now, Rose said that Mark Lewis had been on to him for months to kill Kerry, and when he finally upped the amount to 20 grand, he agreed to it, so he would just shut up about it. Now, Mark Lewis also supplied the pistol. So now the cops had the real story of what went on that Valentine's night, and now they had enough evidence to charge Mark Lewis for murder. In the end, Lindsay got 5 sentences for 5 people he confessed to killing, and his file was marked never to be released. Mark Lewis got 18 years for Fatima's murder and life for Kerry. Now Ron Waters, well, he got 18 months periodic detention, as he really had no idea what was going to happen that night. He was tricked into it, and he did confess as soon as he was arrested. So why did Mark Lewis arrange a hit on his de facto wife with 5 kids, one of them being his own? Well, he didn't like her working at the massage parlour. He probably suspected her of boning some of the customers, so he had it killed. Too gutless to do it himself, he got his hitman mate to do it for him. Fatima just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was the mother to a 6-year-old girl. And why was Kerry so brutally murdered? 18 stab wounds, shot in the eye and a throat slashed? Usually this would be done by someone in a crime of passion. Well, Rose had once been in a relationship with Kerry and they'd broken up on bad terms. Such a tragic Valentine's. Okay, so that was a very brief version of the case, and have a very happy Valentine's Day.
Often, couples go on a meditation date together to relax and bond, and maybe for some of us, try not to fall asleep. You see, the trick is, don't close your eyes all the way. Here, try it with me. Close your eyes, but not all the way. Breathe in deeply and intently. Now, breathe out. Isn't that better? Did you feel all your life stress fall away? Now, let's hear another terrifying story about love gone wrong. This one is from my good friends, Jerry and Tracy, from the Hillbilly Horror Stories.
I have a very unique Valentine's Day ghost story for us.
Oh, cool. I like those.
All right, so we're going to go back to midnight on Thursday, February 14th, 1867. There was two lovers that stood on the bridge in Sefton Park, Liverpool, England. Their names were William Roberts and Alice Harwood. They both knew, though, that very soon that they were going to have to go their own separate ways in life because William's stern middle-class parents had pressured him into an engagement with a wealthy heiress.
So he wasn't feeling it then.
No, he wasn't feeling it. But this is the 1860s, so you did that kind of stuff back then. So they're on this bridge. It's midnight. You could hear the clock in the background, and it chimes the 12th hour. William tearfully told Alice that their 3-year affair would have to end for the sake of his future bride. She was heartbroken.
Oh, I bet she was.
Alice didn't say anything. She just kind of stared off at the reflections of her and William in the waters below, and then she suddenly turned and kissed him with tears streaming from her eyes. Before parting, though, Alice said in a trembling voice, "William, will you grant me one last favor, the only one that I'll ever ask of you on this earth?" And William waited for her request. As he looked, she said, "Promise to meet me here 12 months from tonight at this exact same time, the same hour." William wasn't really big on that suggestion because, he's getting married and stuff. But somehow, deep in his heart, he knew that he had to see his first real love at least one more time. And so, in a broken voice, he replied, "I will come 1 year from today."
Well, good.
The year dragged by, and exactly 12 months later, William and Alice were reunited on that same bridge. But William told Alice that things were a little bit different now. He's married, and he no longer cared for her in a romantic way like he did beforehand. Well, despite William being as honest as he could with her, Alice was still deeply in love with him, and before they left that night, she begged him for one more final reunion at the bridge in 1 year, again on February 14th at midnight. William said that would be impossible. He certainly had no intentions of jeopardizing his loyal relationship that he had with his wife, even though he came to this one.
Oh,
So,
well, that's true.
Guess he was okay with that.
Well, but he promised her, and then he didn't have no way of getting a hold of her and saying, "Hey, I can't make it."
Right. They didn't have cell phones back then in the 1860s. So.
No, so yeah.
Anyway, so Alice starts to cry, and she reminds him that, hey, we did it last year. Let's do it again. And William reluctantly said, "Okay, one more. Only one, though." So they leave the bridge. In February 1869, William was involved in a shooting accident, and he had a really bad leg injury, and he really was unable to walk except for the use of a crutch.
Mm-hmm.
So on the night that they were supposed to be meeting on Valentine's Day, William wondered if he was even going to be able to get to the bridge at all and was even going to be able to make his way out there. He even thought about postponing. But again, no cell phone.
Yeah,
so.
no cell phone.
And, I don't know if he had access to a carrier pigeon or anything.
Morse
code.
code.
Even so on that short notice.
Oh, yeah.
The carrier pigeon, who
Yeah.
knows. But he was a man who kept his word, and he decided to go to the park bridge anyway. Now, they had an old trusted servant of his family by the name of Bob, and Bob already kind of knew about the affair, so I guess they even had the bro code back then. Bob wasn't going to say nothing about it.
Yeah.
And he agreed that he would help William get to the park bridge. He and Bob arrive at the bridge. Now, Bob watched William walk unsteadily, I might add, on his crutches, until he reached the middle of the bridge. The young man sat there, and he was pretty impatient as he was waiting for Alice to arrive. William actually shouted back to Bob, "What on earth am I doing here, standing on the middle of this damn bridge in the freezing night, waiting for a girl that I don't even care for anymore?" Well, Bob wisely stayed silent, because as the clock...
Silent Bob. Oh, sorry.
Because as the clock was chiming midnight in the back, there walked up Alice. And William kind of looked over. He could suddenly see her starting to appear. And William says, "Well, it's about time." But as Alice started to reach William, she didn't show any kind of signs that she was getting ready to slow down or anything. She looked like she was just going to start walking right past him. So William kind of figured, you know what? She's probably pissed off at the comments I just made. So he reached out and was going to try to grab her. As he put his arms out, though, his arms passed right through her.
Oh, boy.
Alice glanced back at an astonished William, I might add, and with a terrible look of sorrow in her eyes, she whispered, "I will always love you." William kind of trembled as he watched Alice continue to walk to the end of the bridge, and there she disappeared right in plain sight of old Bob that was standing there. On the following day, William visited Alice's family because he was really confused about this strange encounter. As William told her parents about this strange encounter, Alice's parents looked at each other, and Miss Hartwood kind of broke down and started crying. And then the father went on to tell William that his daughter had died of a fever last night, shortly before midnight. So William almost fainted when he heard this news. Then the nurse that had been in the house that had been helping take care of Alice, she even added something that made it even more disturbing to William. She said that on the girl's deathbed, she kept constantly repeating the words, "Dead or alive, I must go to that bridge and see William. I must tell him that I love him." It is said that every year at midnight on February 14th, the lonely, loyal ghost of Alice Harwood is seen crossing that bridge in Sefton Park, still apparently hoping to meet her long-dead lover. As recently as May of 2001, a park ranger saw a beautiful, young, outdated-looking woman strolling through the park with a parasol. As she crossed the bridge, the lady vanished into thin air. So I guess the moral of the story is, even in death, love never dies.
Very sweet.
All right, well, happy Valentine's Day, Gaz.
Yeah, happy Valentine's Day, and that's a really sweet story. And I'm glad that she got to tell him that she would always love him, and that's very sweet.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that he showed up. That was very nice of him too. So.
Can you imagine how pissed she would have been if he wouldn't have showed up and she shows up dead?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, what's your excuse? I showed up dead. You can come. You got a hurt leg.
Yeah.
So.
Wuss.
Anyway, thank you guys, and we appreciate you listening to us.
Bye.
Another popular date night is a road trip. Just taking a cruise. Maybe we're headed to our favorite spot, or maybe we have no destination in mind. A good drive always feels good, doesn't it? The trick is to find the scenic route. Play some chill music you can sing to, and put the phones down. Now we're talking. Our next story comes from Tapes from the Dark Side, from my friend Tyler.
There's an old urban legend I grew up with. You may have heard it too. It goes something like this. After sundown, a pair of high school kids, fueled by hormones, park their car on an isolated lover's lane. Just as they start to get down to business, the girl says she hears a strange sound coming from outside the car. The boy says he didn't hear anything, but the girl is spooked and she insists that she wants to go home. The boy begrudgingly turns over the engine and, with a hint of resentment, presses down hotly on the accelerator. The car lurches forward and they're on their way. Once back at the girl's house, she wastes no time in exiting the vehicle, now longing for the comfort and safety of her own home. As she reaches behind her to push close the car door, she sees it, hanging from the door handle. A metal hook. The kind that would make for a rudimentary replacement for a hand, though this one has been sharpened to a menacing and deadly point. And thus our story concludes, a pithy little morality tale. Yet what many don't know is that it's partly based on a true story, the Texarkana Moonlight Murders of 1946. It's a week after Valentine's Day, and the 19-year-old Mary and her 25-year-old boyfriend Jimmy are out on a movie date. On the way home, they take a detour to a secluded stretch of Bowie County Road, a place that was known as a local lover's lane. Just as things are getting hot and heavy, the moment is interrupted by a bright flash of light coming from outside the driver's side window. At first, the couple thinks they've been caught by the police, if only it had been the cops. As they will soon learn, the reality of their situation was much worse. A man wearing a white cloth bag over his head approaches the car. The strange garb resembles a pillowcase and has eye holes cut out so the stranger can see. Before the man says anything, Jimmy mumbles under his breath, "Sorry, guy, you have the wrong car." The man takes a step forward confrontationally and replies,
"I don't want to kill you, so do what I say."
He orders them both out of the car and then tells Jimmy to take off his pants. Seeing that this guy isn't playing around, Jimmy does so quickly, and that's when the man suddenly bashes him in the head twice with the broadside of his heavy flashlight. He struck Jimmy so hard as to cause multiple skull fractures, and the sound of the flashlight hitting his skull was so intense that Mary said she thought that the man had actually shot Jimmy. Jim falls to the ground instantly, unconscious, and that's when the man turns his attention to Mary. She tries to reason with him, offer him money, but this seemed to have the opposite effect. He lashes out at her, striking her with a flashlight, but not as hard as he hit Jimmy. This is more of a warning strike. She jumps back, and that's when he looks her in the eyes and says one single word.
"Run."
I'm TZ, the host of a true crime podcast called Tapes from the Dark Side. If you're enjoying this segment, then consider subscribing to my show. Go to tapesfromthedarkside.com or just search Tapes from the Dark Side in your podcast app. Back to the show.
"Run."
Mary doesn't need to be told twice. She takes off in a full sprint. Some reports say she was still wearing her high heels at the time, so I imagine this was not a breakneck speed. Mary headed down Bowie County Road, desperate to find someone, anyone, but the couple had parked about 100 yards from the nearest house. She sees a car parked on the side of the road in the distance and runs towards it, but alas, finds it empty. And that's when the masked man suddenly reappears.
"Why are you running?"
he asks quizzically. The question puzzles her. "Because you told me to," she says. He screams out, "Liar," and forces Mary to the ground, once again brandishing the pistol. Mary is pinned under the weight of this well-built 6-foot-tall man. And in this moment, which will haunt her for the rest of her life, she feels completely and utterly powerless. He begins to lift up her dress, sliding her underwear to the side and ramming the barrel of the gun into her. After the masked man finished sexually assaulting Mary, he took off on foot down Bowie County Road and disappeared into the woods. Mary wandered aimlessly through the night for half a mile until finally approaching a random house. The couple who answered took her in and phoned the police. Thus ended the first of what would be 4 separate attacks in that year, 1946, by a man in a white hood who would come to be known as the Phantom Killer. This was no urban legend.
It was after the second double murders they started using the name Phantom in the local newspaper. No one felt like he or she was safe. And of course, we had everything locked and we had our guns handy.
Jimmy and Mary both miraculously survived, and it would be the only attack of the 4 in which no one was killed. The Phantom roamed the lanes of Texarkana after dark, looking for couples who were parked on the side of the road. He killed 5 people over the course of 10 short weeks that spring. A manhunt ensued, the likes of which had never been before seen in Texarkana, covering Miller County, Arkansas, and Bowie County, Texas. But the killer was never caught. The Phantom Killer is technically a serial killer, as he's killed more than 2 people with a cooling-off period in between each kill. Now, the statistics tell us that serial killers are responsible for less than 1% of all murders, which is an insignificant portion. But if there are 15,000 murders annually in the U.S., that means that around 150 of those victims are likely the work of such killers. And per FBI statistics, there are likely 25 to 50 active serial killers operating in this country at any given moment. So, dear listener, I would ask of you, if you happen to take a midnight ride with your lover this Valentine's Day, please be cautious. It's far from likely, but you wouldn't want to later find a hook on your car handle door or a masked man peeking through your window.
Texarkana today still looks pretty much the same. And if you should ask people here on the streets what they believe happened to the Phantom Killer, most would say that he is still living here and is walking free.
I love movie theaters. I actually worked at one as one of my first jobs. There's nothing like seeing a movie on the big screen. And don't get me started on the popcorn. That smell and the taste. Now I really want some movie theater popcorn. The bagged microwave stuff just isn't the same. Meeting us here is Allison and Maggie from Coffee and Cases.
It wasn't even supposed to be 19-year-old NC State freshman Jesse McBain's night with the car that he shared with his brother. But it was Friday, February 12th, 1971, 2 days before Valentine's Day. And Patricia Mann, Jesse's girlfriend of 3 years, who was a 20-year-old nursing student at Watts Hospital in Durham, North Carolina, had a school dance that she thought she was going to have to miss.
Oh, does
Yeah.
he surprise her?
He does. He was a good boyfriend. And to her surprise, Jesse had actually made a deal with his brother to trade days with the car. And he was so excited to let Patricia know that he was soon to be on his way to her. He was so happy, in fact, that he jumped in the car to drive through the misty cold rain to get to her. And he did it so quickly that he forgot at home the candy that he had purchased to also bring to her as a surprise.
Oh, well, now he could just eat that later.
That's right. That's a perk for him. Jesse and Patricia had a wonderful time at the dance. They were so obviously in love to everyone who saw the lovebirds. And there was even talk of an engagement in the not so distant future. Neither one of them wanted the night to end. So, given the chance to spend a little bit more time together, they took it. When Patricia's school extended the curfew from midnight until 1 a.m., Patricia checked out of her dorm at 11:30, and the two of them went to a nearby neighborhood that was known to be a local makeout spot.
Okay, very collegey.
Oh, very. Yeah. They're just wanting to get a little bit more alone time. By the next morning, Saturday, February 13th, Patricia's friends were milling about the school, seeing how everyone's night had gone. And it was then that they noticed that Patricia had not returned to her dorm in the early morning hours. That was not like the responsible Patricia they knew. And Jessie was not the type to break rules either. So they began calling local hospitals to make sure that the two hadn't been involved in an accident on their way back to the dorm. No hospitals had record of either Jessie or Patricia having been seen or admitted.
So, did the college not do anything when curfew passed and Patricia wasn't back?
No, it wasn't until the next morning that people are starting to notice that she didn't come back. Without answers, yet knowing where the pair had likely gone with their extra time the night before, some of Patricia's coworkers from the hospital where she worked went looking for them. And that's when they saw the car, just not like how they had expected to find it. At the end of one of the local cul-de-sacs was Jessie's car. Peering in, since the car was locked, they saw Patricia and Jessie's coats in the back seat, neatly placed, and no sign of a struggle.
Okay, weird.
Able to push open one of those triangular vent windows that are commonly found in older cars, a friend was able to get the car unlocked. Inside, they also saw Patricia's pantyhose neatly folded in the passenger floorboard. But Jessie and Patricia, it seemed, had vanished. A lot of people began to wonder, could they possibly have decided to elope? But if so, why not take the car with them?
Yeah, they need the car. Yeah.
And if they didn't elope, why had they just left this perfectly performing car abandoned? And why had the car been wiped of fingerprints, as they found when the police tested it? So until they knew answers, Durham County Police Department, who had been called to the scene, decided to treat this like a missing persons case. But as the days passed with no word, the outlook for Jessie and Patricia's fate was becoming more and more grim. Then, on February 25th, 12 days after they were last seen, there was finally a development, just not the development that any family wants to hear. A surveyor had been out working on a one-lane dirt road near the border between Durham and Orange County, North Carolina, when he saw something out of place. It looked like a human leg sticking out of a pile of leaves. When Orange County Sheriff's Office responded, they found an extremely disturbing scene indeed. Jessie McBain and Patricia Mann had been tied to a tree with a thick rope. The rope was knotted around their hands and their necks. They had been strangled slowly. Major Tim Horn from the Orange County Sheriff's Office told Sarah Kruger of WRAL, quote, "It wasn't one continuous pulling tight of a rope around their necks to strangle them to death. It appeared to be a situation where the rope was tightened. Then they let it go, let them regain their breath, regain consciousness possibly, and then they were strangled again." And
oh my God. This is very vindictive, very personal, I feel.
very. Yeah, this theory was consistent with the fact that there wasn't just one rope mark around the neck of each of the victims, but several strangle marks on each of them. So this had been a process that was repeated over and over. The couple had also been stabbed, according to the medical examiner, though most likely post-mortem. Additionally, Patricia had suffered from an internal injury, a half-inch tear in her liver, consistent with being punched, stomped, or kicked in the stomach. So like you said, Maggie, whoever had done this had wanted the pair to suffer. It also seemed clear, like you said, that anger, revenge, or just a desire to torture were the motive, since Jesse still wore his watch and his class ring, and Patricia still wore her jewelry as well, so nothing was stolen. There also was not sexual assault. Rather, it is law enforcement's working theory that the couple had been approached on Lover's Lane and forced into the trunk of the perpetrator's car before being driven to this remote location. Horn argued in a separate WRAL article, quote, "The suspect knew this area, knew this location. It's our opinion that this wasn't the first time he came down here. He felt comfortable torturing and murdering these two young people, and he felt comfortable enough that no one was going to come and that no one could hear them cry, scream, plead, what have you," end quote. So the perpetrator, according to law enforcement, was not a random stranger passing through. Instead, this was both local
and personal.
Unfortunately, even though many organizations, the Orange County Sheriff's Office, the Durham County Sheriff's Office, the Durham Police Department, the State Department of Investigation, the FBI, and the Department of License and Theft were involved, all of those agencies, there was an obvious lack of collaboration among them, with each getting a small piece of the puzzle, but with no willingness to share findings with any other department.
Well, that's frustrating.
Despite the lack of camaraderie, there were several suspects for the crime, including one who topped everyone's list. A doctor at Watts Hospital, where Patricia worked, who has refused to cooperate with law enforcement, consistently refused to provide DNA, and who has an intimate knowledge of the wooded area where the bodies were found. More recently, a new DNA procedure called MVAC, able to extract DNA from places that were previously inaccessible, like the rope used to bind the pair, was used since the rope from the crime scene had been well preserved over the years. Unfortunately, Horn, nearing retirement in the summer of 2018 when he received the call, heard that the testing had provided no new leads. Now, it's a waiting game until even better DNA testing is available, or until someone who has knowledge of the crime finally has the nerve to come forward. Anyone with information about the murders of Jesse McBain and Patricia Mann, dubbed the Valentine's Day Murders, is asked to contact the Orange County Sheriff's Office at 919-644-3050.
Ice skating and rollerblading is something couples enjoy learning to do on Valentine's Day. Personally, I don't enjoy falling on my face or breaking a bone, but all to their own. I did go ice skating once in college. It wasn't for me. The room was too cold, in all honesty. Speaking of cold, my friend Vincent is here from Gone Cold.
Perhaps no feeling elicits the compulsion for revenge as intensely as betrayal, an act of harm caused by a friend, family member, or lover. Trust is the required prerequisite to the experience of betrayal. Betrayal has a range of potential effects, from shock, sadness, and grief, to anger, obsession, and morbid preoccupation. Most of us can either abstain from revenge entirely, or go no further than performing subtle acts of passive aggression. However, some give in to their compulsion for revenge, whether the result of an extended period of obsession or an impulsive reaction caused by the immediate shock of the actions of the betrayer when caught in the act. Clara Suarez came to the United States from Colombia in the late 1980s to obtain a master's degree in dentistry. After graduating the University of Texas School of Dentistry, Clara was crowned Miss Columbia Houston. In 1991, the 33-year-old dentist met orthodontist Dr. David Harris, same age, while working at the Castle Dental Center. David and Clara hit it off, and their fast-moving romance culminated in a Valentine's Day 1992 wedding, with a reception at the Hilton in Nassau Bay overlooking Clear Lake. It was less than a year after their first date that Clara Suarez became Dr. Clara Harris. With David came a young daughter from a previous marriage. The year following the wedding, Clara opened up her own dental practice that eventually branched out to include several locations, followed shortly thereafter by David opening his place, Space Center Orthodontics, near NASA, Houston. During their outwardly appearing perfect life as husband and wife, in 1998, Clara gave birth to her and David's twin sons. By all accounts, the couple was living the American dream come true. Love, successful businesses, a family, luxury cars, and a nice home in the mostly affluent town of Friendswood. But things were not as they appeared. At least, eventually, they were not. In the fall of 2001, David Harris and his recently hired receptionist, Gail, began a whirlwind love affair. Gail, too, was married. It didn't take long for Clara to put together the pieces. Unexplained high-dollar purchases and five-star hotel bills on their bank statements and long hours at the office were fairly solid clues of her husband's betrayal. In June of 2002, in fact, she could no longer sit idly by obsessing about David's suspected affair. Clara hired Houston-based private investigator firm Blue Moon Investigations. Upon confronting David with proof of his infidelity gathered by Blue Moon, Clara agreed that they could mend the marriage, but only if her husband called off the affair immediately. There was one stipulation he needed to add, David Harris told his wife. Because he'd led his mistress to believe that he and Clara had an open relationship, David said, he needed one last dinner with Gail to call off the affair face to face, to explain and break it to her carefully and easily. Clara agreed, but unbeknownst to David, had asked her private investigator to tail her husband to ensure he was doing what he promised. He apparently was not. Rather than meeting up at a restaurant to put an end to the affair, it was later reported to Clara Harris, David and Gail were sharing a room at Nassau Bay Hilton, where Clara and David enjoyed their wedding reception 10 years earlier alongside friends and family. This was too much. The discovered betrayal, followed by David's promise to stop and work toward fixing what he'd done, and then another betrayal right after. Clara snapped. She immediately began speeding to Nassau Bay to confront her husband and his lover. Her stepdaughter, David Harris's 16-year-old daughter, was in the car. Once at the Hilton, Clara saw the Lincoln Navigator that belonged to her husband's lover. She exited the car, walked up to the vehicle, and began vandalizing it, pulling the sharp end of her car keys across the paint forcefully and bending the windshield wipers. Clara and her stepdaughter entered the hotel, where they found David Harris and Gail in the lobby. Seeing red, and perhaps blacked out by rage, Clara quickly approached. "You bitch, he's my husband," she exclaimed, slapping Gail immediately after the words left her mouth. Clara's attention then turned to the guests and the workers who, in their shock, had either froze in a stare or had avoided looking altogether. Pointing at her husband, Clara shouted, This is Dr. David Harris, and he's fucking this woman. David's daughter was traumatized. Angry at what she'd witnessed, she began hitting her father with her purse. She'd have forgiven him eventually, of course, had she been given the chance. Meanwhile, Clara focused on Gail, ripping the woman's blouse off as she pulled it, and her hair, beat her, and even bit her. David pushed his wife off of Gail, and she fell to the ground. Hotel security quickly moved in and escorted everyone out. In the short moment she waited in her Mercedes-Benz with her stepdaughter, Clara was stewing in rage and boiling with morbid preoccupation. When she saw Gail and David leave the hotel, heading toward her Lincoln, she sped toward them. Her stepdaughter was horrified and begged her to stop. Clara's Mercedes clipped the Lincoln Navigator before hitting David Harris, who flew some 20 feet across the parking lot from the impact. His daughter opened the Mercedes door screaming, but before she could flee, Clara Harris stomped the accelerator. While David laid crumpled and unconscious on the parking lot pavement, Clara drove over him again, the Mercedes violently rocking once when the front tires rolled over him, and again with the back. She continued to drive, U-turned, and ran over the man again, a third time. The Mercedes stopped, and suddenly everything seemed quiet. Clara's stepdaughter bolted from the car, punched her stepmother in the face, and dropped as she cried inconsolably. Clara stepped out of the vehicle, wandered around some, and when the weight of what she'd done came crashing down on her, also began sobbing. When police arrived, she was holding her husband, repeating, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Immediately arrested and subsequently charged with and convicted of second-degree murder, Dr. Clara Harris was sentenced to 20 years in a Texas state penitentiary on February 14, 2003, Valentine's Day, and the 11th anniversary of her marriage to Dr. David Harris. At 8:20 a.m. on Friday, May 18, 2018, after she was previously denied parole twice before, Clara was released from prison early. David Harris died for his betrayal, and for taking his life, Clara Harris lost 15 years of hers.
Rock climbing is a new skill couples love to learn. You get to feel that sense of achievement together. It's fun and exciting. If you're not afraid of heights, that is. I need to get down from here. So up next, we have Live, Laugh, Larceny with my friends Amanda and Trevin.
How do I even begin to describe the word love? Popular songs throughout the years have tried their best to do so, but all seems so bleak. According to Elvis, only fools rush in, but he still couldn't help but fall in love. Soft Cell described the feeling of needing to run away from their tainted love. Even our queen Beyoncé has been crazy in love, being quoted saying, "Uh-oh, uh-oh, uh-oh, oh no," about the subject. I'm sure love has its good moments, but there seem to be many warnings about it as well. The petty crime story I'll be telling you all today is about, you guessed it, love, and the caution of keeping affection separate from transgression. 19-year-old Lei Yu and 18-year-old girlfriend Zhang Chu were deeply in love and living in the Chinese province Sichuan during 2015. With Valentine's Day approaching, Lei wanted to do something special for Zhang. He wanted to give her a romantic experience along with a pricey gift, but his bank account just wasn't cooperating.
Your balance is still negative. Quit checking.
That's when a brilliant idea popped into his head. Lay was going to spoil his Valentine rotten without spending a dime of his own money. The couple's special date night began with Lay driving up to a dark building in a commercial area in town.
"What are we doing here?"
asked Zhang, confused.
"I told you, it's a surprise. Come on."
Lay reassured her, stepping out of the car. The couple walked hand in hand towards the front door of a closed jewelry shop when they came to a stop.
"You may want to stand back,"
Lay lovingly warned. He then kicked the store's door open with the passion of a man in love.
"I wanted to get you something nice."
Lay panted heavily.
But I wanted us
to pick it out together. Zhang was speechless. No one had ever broken into a store for her before.
How dreamy.
She looked around the empty and barely lit shop, seeing jewelry and glass perfume bottles glistening in the moonlight. She could have swooned right there. But instead, she grabbed Lay's hand and the couple rushed inside. Zhang excitedly picked out some jewelry and perfume and was ready to flee the scene of their criminal shopping spree. But Lay had one more surprise. He busted open the store's register and gathered the cash inside, forming a money bouquet of sorts for his date. "You deserve the world, but for now, how does some extra cash sound?" Lay said in his best Prince Charming voice. The pair stared lovingly into each other's eyes as they crouched down behind the store's register. They both knew they should run away from the store in fear authorities may be on the way. But the sexual tension overshadowed all logic.
Oh my God.
Both of them leaned their bodies in closer and closer to one another, turned their faces, and exchanged a fiery kiss. Only once their makeout was complete did the couple flee the scene. Lay and Zhang were blissfully unaware that a store camera had captured their affection and faces on CCTV. Shortly after the theft, police analyzed and shared the CCTV footage, getting a tip from a social media user that led to their arrest. The store's owner, Gong Chen, said,
"They were amateurs because apart from the cash, they did not take anything of value. There were cameras and laptop computers and smartphones, and they left it all behind because they were so busy kissing. That kiss was their undoing."
The love-struck larcenist made off with 2,100 won, approximately $301 US, jewelry, and perfume. But according to local news reports, they were let off with no charges following a full confession. Perhaps this crime could have been avoided if this couple would have been listening to Can't Buy Me Love by the Beatles that night. But we will never know. What I can say is that love is nearly impossible to explain. And even more unexplainable is the trouble it can get us all into.
And the truth shall set you free. That's crazy.
I know.
A confession just gets you out of it.
I don't know if the laws are different.
I'm sure they are.
Guarantee that they are all around the world. But if I knew that just a simple confession after a makeout sesh could get me off the hook for committing a crime, yeah, I think I would do that.
Yeah. To be in that much love.
They were in so much love, and I hope I explained it as well as I could in the story that really the only reason they were caught is because they shared that passionate kiss in the CCTV footage. And then once the police shared it online, because the way they turned their faces and the way they were acting, somebody was able to identify them online.
Wow.
So really, this Valentine's Day, you really need to be cautious with your love.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe don't do it while committing a crime.
Definitely not.
So if anybody has not heard of us or listened to our show before, we are Live, Laugh, Larceny, and we are the show that takes petty crimes and tell them in a dramatic way, but the details may vary sometimes. Yours seems pretty standard here. Is everything pretty much all the truth here?
Yes, they did steal that exact amount of cash, the perfume, and the jewelry. It was closed at the time. I don't know exactly how they busted in the front door.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it was really all his idea and he was surprising her for a Valentine's Day experience / gift.
Mm-hmm.
That whole thing was just me, setting the tone for the story. But everything about the crime itself, everything that the store owner said was her actual quote, and how they were caught was the truth. Usually that's kind of how it goes with our show. We'll kind of create the story in our own minds. How did we get here? What would cause a person to do some of the ridiculous crimes that we cover? But we try to keep the actual facts of the crime as true can get. We just like to be a little dramatic and petty with it.
Yeah, we like to be fun, and as I've always called it, we basically make the movie version of it.
And with that story, we will conclude the first night of this 2-night special episode for My Bloody Valentine. As a quick reminder, all of the podcasts you heard can be found wherever you listen to podcasts. A complete list of the podcast names and links to them can be found in this episode's show notes. I'll be back tomorrow for the last half of this Bloody Valentine special, highlighting love gone wrong. I'll see you then. Welcome back to My Bloody Valentine, our 2-part Valentine Day special. If you're just joining and haven't listened to the first part of this special, I suggest you do so. I have 7 more podcaster friends who will be joining me for crime stories of love gone wrong in this episode. But first, are you curious who this mysterious Saint Valentine is? Well, it's really a mystery. We know that the Catholic Church recognizes at least 3 different saints by that name. One legend goes that Valentine was a priest that served during the 3rd century in Rome. One of the Roman emperors decided to outlaw marriage for young men because they made better soldiers. A priest named Valentine defied the emperor and continued to perform marriages for young lovers in secret. Later, the emperor found out, and Valentine was put to death. But others will say it came from Valentine of Terni, a bishop who was also beheaded by the same Roman emperor. Both Valentines became saints after their deaths. Whichever may be the case, Valentine's Day is a day of love, until that love goes wrong. Which brings us to our next story, from my friends Raven and Mandy from Sirens.
Please send an ambulance, please.
What's the problem?
My wife, I think my wife is dead.
Sir?
Please send, listen, I'm a doctor. I've been trying CPR. Please send somebody, quick.
Okay. Is she not breathing?
No, she's not breathing. I don't get pulse, please.
Okay.
Hurry.
You're doing CPR on her?
Yes, I'm trying. Yeah, I'm going to hang up so I can continue,
All right.
please.
We'll be right there.
Okay.
February 14th, 2001, Susan Hamilton had been strangled and brutally beaten in her own bathroom. Her naked body was discovered by her husband, John, that Valentine's Day morning.
Dr. Hamilton was an OBGYN doctor who had privileges at several different Oklahoma City hospitals, one of which I worked at. I was an office manager for a doctor and would see him in the doctor's lounge on several occasions.
So according to Dr. John Hamilton himself, he had been up at dawn for a 7 a.m. surgery at an outpatient clinic That surgery was over by 8 a.m., and afterwards, John stopped by the hospital where he had another procedure scheduled for later that morning. Afterwards, the doctor decided to swing back home. He was only at home for a few minutes because at 9 a.m. his pager went off. It was the hospital calling him to get back for a second surgery. By 9:30, he was scrubbing up for the operation, a complicated removal of a tumor. The procedure went off without a hitch, and later, none of the other doctors reported anything at all unusual in his behavior.
By 10:45, he was on his way home again, which is when he says he discovered Susan in a pool of blood. So the timeline was extremely tight for the doctor to even be considered as a suspect.
Investigators found a Valentine's Day card at the scene from Susan to John, and it was opened. The card had been found inside John's Jaguar. Susan's message inside said, quote, "Obviously, I bought this before last Monday, so I guess maybe they don't seem as appropriate now, but I do love you. Have a good day, Susan."
Susan's friend Susan Johnston, who lived next door, said Susan had noticed that John was getting a lot of cell calls. Susan demanded to see John's cell phone bill.
She finds a huge number, and I'm talking close to 100 phone calls to this phone, back and forth to John. And she gets very suspicious and confronts John about it. John had an explanation for his wife that the patient had been having some serious psychological problems and had even threatened suicide. John, the good doctor, was simply trying to counsel her, and while he may have stepped over his boundaries professionally, he said he never had an affair with her.
Alina Aguirre, a topless dancer for 8 years, testified she had performed table dances at 2 of the clubs in Oklahoma City for the doctor. She said that he overpaid her for dances that only cost $20 each. The dancer, also known as Nina, had first went to Dr. Hamilton in the early 90s when she saw him at his office for an abortion. She said he would give her samples of medication she needed for depression when she didn't have any money to buy any of the prescription drugs herself.
Nina said that he was calling her like 10 or more times a day. And on February 8th, after Susan learned of the cell phone calls, that Dr. Hamilton wrote Nina in a letter saying he could no longer be her doctor. The dancer said Hamilton told her that he loved his wife and didn't want to get a divorce.
Soon after arrival, the investigators started questioning Dr. Hamilton himself. By then, there'd been that neighbor's tip about problems in the Hamilton marriage from Susan, the next door neighbor. The doctor's behavior in the minutes after finding Susan dead seemed off.
Hamilton had told the 911 operator he was performing CPR, but when the first responders showed up, firefighter David Bradbury arrived on the scene, and he thought there was something odd about the way that the doctor was performing the chest compressions. David Bradbury said, quote, "He had one hand on her chest, one hand on her abdomen. The way that we are taught to do CPR, we interlock our hands. The palm goes on the center of the chest, on the sternum, something in which Dr. Hamilton should have been well versed in."
Dr. Hamilton had said, "I talked to the surgery nurse and she said the surgery before yours started 30 minutes late. I still had 15 or 20 minutes leeway in there, but because it was Valentine's Day, I wanted to give Susan her first Valentine's Day card. Start her day off right before she got busy with her meeting. And Susan's getting ready, trying to get dressed, and we kissed. I gave her her Valentine's card. She went to the closet and got one and gave it to me." It is also stated that by Susan's daughter that Susan had threatened divorce in December, but decided against it and to go to therapy with John. This was just 2 months prior to the murder. As the detectives looked more closely into the doctor's timeline that day of surgery, they learned that the second surgery, originally scheduled for 9 a.m., hadn't actually started until 9:40 a.m. And why was it delayed? Because Dr. Hamilton was late.
To investigators, that delay opened up the doctor's window of opportunity by up to an hour. Late that Valentine's Day afternoon, they arrested John Hamilton for the murder of his wife.
The investigators then placed Dr. Hamilton in the back of the police car. And it was there that they kind of noticed odd behavior. Detective Teresa Sterling said that he was acting very upset. He was banging his head into the screen.
He was jailed immediately and denied any bail. She was talking about leaving him, and so the motive was lost love. Believing that Susan Hamilton's threat of divorce was enough to make the doctor snap, prosecutors developed a theory that the couple had argued that morning after exchanging the cards. The doctor then came back later with murder on his mind. In December of 2001, Dr. John Hamilton was being tried for her murder. The medical examiner had determined that Susan had been strangled with 2 neckties, but her fatal injuries came from being bludgeoned with a blunt object never found at the scene. Investigators had to interpret the blood evidence left behind, and for that, they hired a bloodstain expert named Ross Gardner.
Gardner carefully examined everything the doctor had been wearing that morning. A lot of the blood on his clothing could be explained by his attempt to administer CPR, but the expert looked at John's shoes, the left one in particular. The shoes were found near Susan's body. John said that they fell off his feet as he was attempting to revive her. The expert, though, Gardner, was certain that whoever was wearing that left shoe that day was present when Susan was being bludgeoned also.
But the most damning blood evidence of all may have been found in the doctor's car, on the steering wheel and the driver's side seat and door sill. Crime scene investigators recovered strands of Susan's hair and pieces of her flesh. Tom Bevel, the blood spatter expert hired by Dr. John Hamilton, as the last witness in the trial, he refuted a lot of the prosecution's findings and bolstered his client's case.
The prosecutor tossed out an open-ended question. Well, Mr. Bevel, is there anything that the state experts of Oklahoma City Police Department missed in their examination of the evidence?
The blood spatter expert on the stand, on the payroll of the defense, something he noted and what would later be regarded as the atomic bomb of the trial of Dr. John Hamilton.
It was about that bloody shirt taken from the doctor. He said, "In my examination, I found additional blood that was not talked about anywhere on the inside of the right cuff."
The defense expert was saying that Dr. John Hamilton most likely created those bloodstains by bashing his wife's skull.
On redirect, Dr. Hamilton's lawyer tried to defuse the bombshell testimony, but his argument would not be enough.
It took the jurors just 2 hours to reach their verdict. The doctor realized he'd been scuttled by his own man.
A great way to spend Valentine's Day is to go shopping together. It can be fun and therapeutic, and you can, of course, buy each other gifts to show each other how much you appreciate them, if that's their love language, of course. We are meeting my next friend here, Robin, from The Trail Went Cold.
So for this Valentine's Day special, I'm going to be discussing the perfect Valentine's-themed cold case, as it involves a couple who got married on Valentine's Day, the husband being found murdered on Valentine's Day exactly 1 year later, and his wife becoming a suspect. And there are just so many crazy elements to this story. The victim in question was 26-year-old William Edward Trimbach, who went by the name Billy, and he was originally born in Morgan County, Colorado, before he moved to Carlin, Nevada during his childhood. Billy had 2 children with his first wife before their marriage ended in divorce, but on February the 14th, 1992, he got remarried to 37-year-old Cindy Trimbach, who had 4 children of her own from a previous marriage. The couple then moved to Billy's home state of Colorado, where he started his own automotive and diesel repair business in the unincorporated community of Stoneham. However, Cindy would soon receive some life-changing news when she learned she had contracted the HIV virus, which developed into AIDS, so doctors gave her about 2 years to live. Since Cindy's ex-husband, Bob Osmundson, also contracted AIDS, she suspected that she originally got it from him. To further complicate matters, Cindy was also pregnant with Billy's child during this time period. She would give birth to a daughter named Allison, who turned out to be perfectly healthy and did not have the AIDS virus. Most of the money Billy made from his business went towards Cindy's medical care, and they would even travel to Mexico to seek out experimental treatments for her disease. Well, on the couple's 1-year wedding anniversary, which happened to be Valentine's Day in 1993, Cindy contacted the Weld County Sheriff's Office in order to report Billy missing, claiming that she had not seen him since the previous morning of February the 13th. Cindy's 9-year-old son, James Osmondson, told police that he saw Billy leaving their house that morning with an unidentified man driving a white sports car, and he believed that Billy was planning to help the man repair something. Well, on the same day he was reported missing, Billy's body was discovered in neighboring Morgan County in a snowbank on the north side of the Interstate 76 frontage road near the small town of Wiggins. He had been shot at close range in the head, abdomen, and arm. The location was about 45 miles away from Stoneham, and it was suspected that Billy was shot elsewhere before his body was dumped by the road. In an odd coincidence, on the night before Billy's body was found, the Morgan County Sheriff had actually driven by that exact spot and recalled seeing multiple vehicles parked there. In retrospect, the sheriff believed he may have unknowingly driven past Billy's killers, dumping his body. Investigators started to become suspicious of Cindy when she told them she had also driven by that same spot on the evening of February the 13th while she was searching for Billy. But like I just mentioned, the location was 45 miles from where the Trimbox lived, and Billy and Cindy did not have any known ties to the area, so why would she have felt the need to drive all the way out there? It almost appeared as if Cindy was trying to fabricate a cover story in case any eyewitnesses saw her in Morgan County that night. Investigators also discovered that a $440,000 insurance policy had been taken out on Billy's life shortly before his death, and it appeared that his name had been forged on the application. They decided to perform a search of Cindy's Chevy Suburban and found some small amounts of dried blood on the back seat, which were consistent with Billy's blood. There were also some items in the vehicle which seemed to match items which had been discovered near the spot where Billy's body was dumped. While the murder weapon was never found, a 9mm handgun Billy owned was missing from his home, and his gunshot wounds were consistent with a 9mm. Due to the cloud of suspicion surrounding her, Cindy decided to take her kids and leave Colorado almost immediately after Billy's funeral, and they relocated to Cindy's original hometown of Butte, Montana. But then the case would go in a truly tragic and unexpected direction. On April the 12th, 1994, the Butte-based newspaper, the Montana Standard, published an extensive article about Cindy's struggles with AIDS and her being a suspect in Billy's murder. It was common knowledge throughout the community that Cindy and her first husband, Bob, were both dying of AIDS, and their son, James, who was 10 years old at this point, was frequently teased and bullied by the other kids about this while attending Margaret Leary Elementary School. Well, it appeared that James finally reached his breaking point because on the very same morning that the Montana Standard ran their article about his mother, James showed up at school with a .22 caliber pistol. James then proceeded to pull out the gun on the playground, challenge one of his tormentors to a fight, and then fired off 3 shots. One of the shots wound up striking an 11-year-old student named Jeremy Bullock in the head behind the ear. Jeremy died the following day, and to make the situation even more tragic, he was not one of the kids who had been bullying James and was only caught in the line of fire. At the time, James was considered to be the youngest school shooter in American history, though that record has since been broken. Given his young age, James was too young to be charged with murder, so he was sentenced to 2 years in a residential psychiatric treatment center and wound up being placed in foster care following his release. By that point, James's mother and father had both died due to complications from AIDS, with Cindy passing away on March 1st, 1995, at the age of 40. Morgan County investigators eventually decided to travel to Montana to re-interview James, and he finally admitted that his story about having seen Billy leave their house with a man in a white sports car was false, and he had lied to protect his mother. However, even though Cindy is now deceased, the authorities do not consider this case to be closed, as they believe that she hired at least 2 people to kill Billy. Over the years, various informants have told law enforcement that a drug dealer from the municipality of Fort Morgan had bragged about murdering Billy with an accomplice. It's been reported that one of these potential suspects was ready to confess to the crime, but his attorney would not allow him to be interviewed, and he decided to kill himself in 1998. The other potential suspect appears to be a man named James Samuel England, who was arrested in April of 2008 on unrelated burglary and car theft charges and publicly named as a person of interest in Billy's murder by the Morgan County Sheriff's Office. But it seems apparent that investigators lack the necessary evidence to file murder charges against England or anyone else who might be involved. In 2018, on the 25th anniversary of the crime, the authorities did confirm that the investigation was still open, and they believed there was still a killer on the loose in rural Colorado. Well, we have now officially reached the 30-year anniversary of the crime, but unfortunately, the murder of Billy Trimbach continues to remain unsolved. So yes, I'll say it. I guess you could say the trail went cold. And happy Valentine's Day, I guess.
Skydiving with your Valentine is fun if you're into thrills and adventure. You can both take the jump together to feel alive and energized for the rest of the year. Up next is Method and Madness with my friend Dawn.
Sweetheart, my true heart, I know there are girls with more shapely bodies, but I'm not carrying what they have. I have the greatest part of all blessings, a noble man's deep, true, eternal love. How impatient I am and will be. I want to look up into your dear face for hours as you touch my body close. The words, the language, it was all indicative of the time period, a century ago, the roaring 20s, prohibition, jazz, and Americans bringing the latest gadget, radios, into their living rooms. But these words were not lyrics from a ballad. No, these words were written in lead pencil, on paper, found amongst other torn letters just like it, in the grass, near the two bodies, on Philip's farm. It was there under a crabapple tree in a field of goldenrod, outside New Brunswick, New Jersey, that the lovers were discovered that Saturday, September 16, 1922, purely by chance. It was a man and his underage girlfriend that came across the scene while out for a walk. It was obviously foul play. The couple was lying on their backs, next to each other. She was dressed in a polka dot dress and stockings, her legs crossed. He, in a dark suit, his coat torn and muddy from being on the ground for so long, and his Panama hat pulled down over his face. His right arm was outstretched, and propped against his foot was a business card that identified him. It read, Reverend Edward W. Hall, Church of St. John the Evangelist, New Brunswick, New Jersey. The 41-year-old pastor of the local church was a victim of a homicide, a single bullet to his right temple. His companion was 33-year-old Eleanor Reinhardt Mills, a soprano in the church choir. Her wounds hinted that the killer, or killers, had targeted her more aggressively. She had 3 bullet wounds to her head, and underneath a scarf covering her neck, a deep laceration to her throat. And it would be determined years later, her tongue had been cut out. The pair had been dead for at least 36 hours. The scene, including the placement of the 2 bodies, suggested a purposeful, thought-out act of murder and staging, from love letters strewn about the bodies to the way the bodies were positioned. She called him Babykins. He called her his Wonder Heart. The 2 victims, it turned out, were married, but not to each other. Their affair began about 4 years previously in the church, igniting rumors and prompting whispers of a scandalous nature, a pastor, a member of the choir, love letters tucked safely inside hymn books and passed back and forth to each other on Sundays. Now, in a symbolic display, those letters were out in the open, the affair exposed, the rumors confirmed, the whispers now of a different, darker nature. Victim Eleanor Mills was married to James Mills, an officer of the church. Victim Reverend Edward Hall was married to Frances Stevens, a wealthy heiress. She was insistent that the relationship between her husband and Mrs. Mills was purely platonic, not romantic in nature. The killer clearly wanted the public to believe otherwise. But despite the not-so-subtle staging of the scene and potential for oodles of evidence, this double homicide was mishandled from the start, from the police arguing over jurisdiction to reporters handling the Reverend's business card, from the curious public flocking to the grassy area to snag pieces of dirt, to peeling bits of bark from the crabapple tree to keep as souvenirs. And that mishandling had a significant impact on the investigation. What could have been an open and shut case would drag on for years. Meanwhile, the tabloids were salivating. The crime had everything that sells newspapers: love, lust, betrayal, jealousy, violence, mystery. Some headlines in the following weeks read, "Murder of popular pastor and choir leader stirs entire state," and "When murder lifts a small town's lid." And the news was spreading outside of that small town and outside of that state. At breakfast tables all over the country, folks would sit down with their cup of coffee and their newspaper, eager to see what the latest headline would be. The tabloids out of neighboring New York City fanned the fire and kept the country's interest in the case. So much so that today, it's been said, those tabloids may have been the reason a trial finally took place. They relentlessly reported on the lack of progress in the case, with headlines like, "Sorry Spectacle of Justice" and "Hall slain a year ago, but justice slumbers." Accusations had been aimed in all sorts of directions. At the couple who discovered the bodies, then to the spouses of the victims, of course, but ultimately, it was Reverend Hall's widow, Frances, her brothers, and her cousin that became official suspects, accused even by an eccentric woman that swore she witnessed the murders, despite doubts about her credibility. And it wasn't until 4 years later, the same amount of time that the lovers' romance had sustained, that a trial took place in nearby Somerville, New Jersey. The defendants were the Reverend's widow, Frances, and her brothers Henry and William. Their destiny, if convicted, was the electric chair. It made sense. Like a Shakespearean tragedy, the two lovers' ardent affair found out, their written expressions discovered in a drawer by a jealous wife, the heroic brothers coming in to defend her honor, a confrontation by moonlight, and then the final scene as the two traitors, the star-crossed lovers, meet their demise, with more violent attention paid to the young mistress in an additional act of vengeance. But alas, in the end, it was a comment in an article from the Daily News on November 20th, 1922, that predicted the outcome. Quote, "Indictments will either be returned or the case will be forever relegated to the annals of unsolved crimes." And so it was the latter. The trial ended in December of 1926 with no convictions. All three suspects were acquitted, and a century later, those murders, still discussed in a more modern sense on social media and Reddit forums. Books have been written, theories tossed around, but the case remains officially unsolved. Although only 3 people stood trial for the Hall Mills murder, and all 3 were acquitted, what happened on Phillips Farm in late September 1922? Was it the Reverend's wife, Had she discovered the truth about her husband's affair? Did she insist his relationship with Eleanor Mills was platonic as part of a greater plan to maintain innocence? Or was it Eleanor's husband, the officer of the church, who set out one evening to kill his wife, the mother of his 2 children, and her prominent lover? Or another theory that it was the work of the Ku Klux Klan, who had been active in areas of New Jersey in the 1920s. If only that crabapple tree could talk. The true extent of the romance between Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills, their love for one another, would live on through those letters they'd poured their hearts into, along with diaries they had each kept and wrote in daily to express how much they missed each other, how one couldn't live without the other. Those writings would become their legacy.
Walking on a beach is a delightful way to enjoy a nice evening together. I brought a picnic for us to enjoy after a long walk. Meeting us here is my friend Lainey from True Crime Cases with Lainey.
A swinger's lifestyle can be great for some, or it can be problematic for others. For one newly married couple, a wild night of sex and drugs turned deadly. Okay, on to the show. In March 2013, Actora Bankhead was released from the Indiana Department of Corrections. He had been convicted on February 13, 1997, of carjacking. Actora met Diane Lynn Smith shortly after leaving the Department of Corrections. After dating for a week and only knowing each other for less than 4 weeks, they married on April 23, 2013. The couple moved into Diane's house on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Street in Indianapolis. According to Actora himself, he found a job just a few days after being released from prison and was set on following the straight and narrow path. Actora also believed Diane was the love of his life and a godsend. On June 15, 2013, 2 bodies were found in a vacant lot in the 1100 block of Miley Avenue in Indianapolis, Indiana. An attempt had been made to burn the bodies. The 2 were identified as 27-year-old Michael Haidt and 34-year-old Crystal Lucas. Actora Bankhead was soon arrested for the 2 murders, as it was Diane who had called the police to report the bodies and how they had gotten there. In the early morning hours of June 7, 2013, Diane had come home from work. Diane and Actora were in bed when Actora received a phone call from Michael. He got up and went downstairs to talk to Michael. Now, not long after, Michael came over to their house, parking his car on Indianapolis Avenue near their house. Diane stayed upstairs while Actora and Michael sat downstairs, drinking and talking. Sometime later, Diane heard a female's voice join in, and she heard Michael tell Actora he had just met this woman, Crystal, at the liquor store. Diane went to sleep, but just after she drifted off, Actora came to the bedroom and woke her up, asking her to drive the trio somewhere to get some crack. Diane said no initially, but Actora kept on pestering her until she finally agreed. Diane drove them to an apartment at 38th Street and Boulevard Place, where Michael got out and went inside. He was in there for about 10 minutes before returning to the van. Once they returned to the house, Diane again went upstairs and went to sleep. Yet again, Actora came in and woke her up, saying he was high and he wanted all 4 of them to have sex. Diane said she didn't roll like that and refused. But once again, Actora pestered her until she relented. Michael and Crystal joined them in the bedroom and they swapped partners. Crystal became upset when she realized Michael had sex with Diane without protection. Crystal knew Michael was HIV positive and related this information to Diane. Diane became angry, and so did Actora, saying this was like a death sentence for Diane. Actora lured Michael into the basement where he attacked him with a stun gun. Once he had Michael subdued, he hogtied him and popped his neck. Worried about Crystal going to the police and believing Diane to be jealous of her, he decided to kill her too. As with Michael, he lured Crystal downstairs and subdued her, then popped her neck too. Although it sounds as if he had broken their necks with his bare hands, the coroner reported that they had died from asphyxiation. Crystal's hyoid bone was fractured, and Michael had a fracture to his thyroid cartilage. The next afternoon, Diane went to work, not knowing what had transpired in her basement. She returned home in the early morning hours of Saturday when Actora told her that Michael and Crystal were gone. When she asked for clarification, Actora made a hand gesture across his neck. He admitted to killing them and then took Diane into the basement to show her their bodies. Diane saw the two naked and hogtied, lying on top of each other. Actora told her she would have to help dispose of the bodies or she would wind up like them. Diane went to work on Saturday afternoon, and when she returned home early Sunday morning, they began disposing of the bodies. The two loaded the bodies into Diane's minivan, then Diane drove, following Actora's directions. He instructed her to drive to a vacant lot on Miley Avenue, and they placed the bodies in some trees at the edge of the lot. While Actora removed the plastic, Diane returned to the van. He put the plastic in trash bags, then poured gasoline on the bodies and lit them. Diane later told police that it was raining and the bodies would not stay lit. After they left, Actora had Diane drive to an apartment complex where he threw the trash bags in the dumpster. After returning home, the couple removed valuables from Michael's car, including the stereo. Diane then drove it to another apartment complex before they returned home and went to bed. Over the next week, Actora kept a close eye on her and would not let her leave his side. During the same time, a friend of Michael's who knew he was at the Bankhead's house began distributing missing persons flyers in Diane's neighborhood. Michael had called this friend and said he was visiting with Actora, and then the friend saw Michael's car on Indianapolis Avenue before Diane moved it. On Friday, June 14th, 1 week after the murders, Actora finally left Diane alone for a time. She called the Indianapolis police and changed the locks. Diane spoke to Detective Harry Dunn and told him about the murders and where to find the bodies. When Detective Dunn sent an officer to the lot on Miley Avenue, the bodies were located in a severe state of decomposition and infested with maggots. In addition to the 2 murder charges, Actora was charged with intimidating Diane. While in jail awaiting trial, Actora met Jeremy Bullock. Jeremy was in jail awaiting trial on 2 burglary cases. Jeremy had previously been in prison for a murder he committed when he was 17. While in prison for his murder charge, Jeremy had been attacked several times for being a snitch. When Actora went on trial, Jeremy testified that Actora had confessed to him in jail. Actora's attorney wanted to introduce evidence that Jeremy's sentence had been reduced due to his testimony in the David Cam case, but the state objected to this. In a concession, however, the court did say the defense attorneys could question Jeremy about testifying in a different murder trial because his motive in trying to bargain for himself was relevant. The defense questioned Jeremy about his involvement with the 2006 murder trial and his sentence modification afterwards. They also mentioned his current charges and the expected sentence. Interestingly, they also discussed how in October 2014, Jeremy had written a letter to a judge asking for leniency in his probation revocation case since he was cooperating with some murder cases in Marion County. Additionally, in the 9 months he had been in jail awaiting trial, Jeremy had written 8 letters to the Marion County prosecutor, each one talking about other defendants, most in jail on murder charges. Despite the somewhat uncanny knack Jeremy seemed to have for hearing confessions, Actora was found guilty on 2 charges of murder, but not guilty on the intimidation charge. He was sentenced to 125 years in prisons, 60 years on one charge, 65 years on the other. Actora appealed his sentence, stating the prosecution prejudiced him by showing the photo of the bodies riddled with maggots. However, this photo was never shown during the trial, only mentioned. He also appealed because his defense was limited by not being able to mention the David Cam trial. The third point of the appeal was the dubiousness of Diane's testimony. All 3 points were overturned and the sentence affirmed. On the second point, the appeals court said his attorneys were able to question Jeremy Bullock without mentioning David Camm's name. The appeals court also said that the dubiousness of Diane's testimony was not valid because she was not the sole witness. Because Michael's friend knew that Michael was at the Bankhead's home, he also testified. Diane was never charged with anything, a fact that leaves Actora Bankhead puzzled and angry. In writings he did, available on the internet, he claims she was a master manipulator and a pathological liar. He says he did not have anything to do with the murders and accuses Diane, but this leaves some questions such as how did she get the bodies out of the house on her own? And how did she commit the murders? Actora continues to appeal his sentence and is confident he will get it overturned someday. He writes from prison and wants to sell his work to try and earn money for a better defense. He claims he was railroaded from day one and says investigators overlooked obvious clues he was not involved, although he does not say what these are. Nothing about Diane could really be found, except she filed for divorce on June 26, 2015, and the divorce was granted on September 28, 2015. A detailed obituary was not located for Crystal, just a passing mention about her services, which were held several weeks after her body was found. However, an obituary was found for Michael Haidt. His family said he had a loving heart and was the epitome of a Southern gentleman. His smile lit up a room.
Finding places where live music is playing and just relaxing is another popular date night. The trick is to make sure you know what kind of music your partner enjoys and match their taste well. Otherwise, you may just be annoying them with music they hate for the entire evening. Up next is my friend Charlie from Crime Lines.
It is a story of love that turned to control and then to murder. It started innocently enough with Daphne Wright logging into a chat room in the late 1990s looking for love. Having been born deaf, the internet introduced Daphne to a larger group of people to communicate with. She met a woman named Jackie from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and she moved from Maryland to South Dakota to start her new life. This relationship didn't last, but the two remained friends and roommates. In August of 2002, Daphne met the love of her life, Sally Collins. Sally and Daphne left the state for a little while, but when they decided to move back to Sioux Falls, Jackie welcomed them to live in her house to help out with the bills. The problem was that Jackie and Sally didn't get along well, in part due to this tension and in part due to her cooling feelings towards Daphne. Sally moved out. She found an apartment in a complex known as the Deaf Apartments because a lot of deaf people live there. Though Sally had taken a big step away from her 4-year relationship with Daphne Wright by moving out, they were still seeing each other off and on, with Daphne growing more and more anxious as she was losing control of Sally's heart. While playing cards one day at the local deaf club, Sally met 42-year-old Darlene Vander Giesen, and the two became fast friends. It was a friendship that made Daphne jealous, believing that Darlene was trying to steal Sally from her. It was an irrational jealousy because Darlene only dated men, and she and Sally were and always would be just friends. One night in late January 2006, Daphne went over to Sally's apartment unannounced and found her hanging out with Darlene. Daphne's anger boiled over and she started signing to Darlene that she was ruining her relationship with Sally. Sally told Daphne to leave, and when she refused, Sally then asked Darlene to leave just to defuse the situation. As Darlene left, Daphne made an obscene gesture towards her. Daphne and Sally continued to argue until Sally called the police and the police told Daphne to go. Daphne stormed off, telling Sally she would be very sorry. Then, 5 days after the argument, Darlene Vandergiesen didn't show up to work. The next day, her parents reported her missing. A family member told the police that Darlene had been getting some insulting emails from a woman named Wendy Smith. These emails called Darlene fat and told her that she had elephant feet. Darlene didn't know anyone with the name Wendy Smith, so she believed it was someone using a fake name to send these emails. The police took Darlene's computer in for a search and found the emails. Based on some of the specific grammatical errors, the investigators deduced the writer was likely deaf, like Darlene, and English was their second language after American Sign Language. In continuing to check Darlene's inbox, they also found an email from Daphne Wright that matched the same syntax from the emails that came from Wendy Smith. So they checked the IP on the Wendy Smith emails, and it led them right to downtown Sioux Falls to the home of Jackie, where Daphne was still living. At first, Daphne denied to the police that she sent the Wendy Smith emails, but eventually fessed up to it. Over the course of the interview, Daphne changed her story 7 times, but she denied having anything to do with Darlene's disappearance. She admitted she wanted Darlene to stay away from Sally, but she insisted that she and Darlene had smoothed things over after the argument at Sally's apartment. Based on the emails sent and Daphne's changing story, the police got a search warrant for her house. And when they entered, they were immediately hit by a number of smells, the strongest of which were paint and cleaning chemicals. The smell grew stronger as they approached the basement door. When they headed down the stairs, they found swatches of blue paint on the walls and the floor and the stairs. Not an even coat, but rather a quick, spotty patch job. In scraping the paint, they found small amounts of blood, tissue, and bone fragments and bone chips. And in a trash can upstairs, they found a half-empty bottle of chainsaw lubricant and a receipt for a chainsaw. They sent the biological material to the lab to test it against Darlene's DNA. Believing that Darlene Vandergiesen had not just been killed but also dismembered by Daphne Wright, they began a landfill search. The next day, the DNA results came back on the blood and biological matter from the basement. It was Darlene's. Additional DNA from Darlene was found on the bumper of an SUV that Daphne regularly used. So even without a body, they felt they had enough to move forward with the significant amount of circumstantial and forensic evidence. 43-year-old Daphne Wright was arrested and charged in the murder of 42-year-old Darlene Vandergiesen. But this wouldn't continue as a no-body case for long. The search of the landfill continued, and 5 days after starting the search, Darlene's partial remains were found, along with additional evidence linking her to both Daphne's home and to Daphne herself. More of Darlene's dismembered remains were later found in a ditch in Minnesota. At trial, the state claimed that Daphne had lured Darlene to her house by telling her she was planning a Valentine surprise for Sally. Once she had her there, Daphne killed Darlene and dismembered her in the basement. Daphne's defense was the Robert Durst defense. Sure, the state could prove Daphne dismembered Darlene, but they couldn't prove she killed her. Perhaps Darlene had died falling down the stairs, and Daphne, afraid of being blamed, dismembered her body and tried to dispose of the evidence. The jury didn't buy it and convicted Daphne, but she was spared the death penalty. She remains in prison for murdering a woman she perceived as a romantic rival, who was really just being a good friend to the woman Daphne didn't just want to love, but to control.
Riding horses is a fun date. Horses are majestic, and riding them is fun, especially on trails you've never been on before. If you aren't comfortable with riding horses, carriage rides are always the next best thing. Up next is Love Murder with my friends Jesse and Andy.
Love. Nothing else has the incredible power to move people like love. A mother's love can give them the strength to lift a car to save their toddler. It can inspire incredible works of art and literature. It can bring communities together. But the flip side of love is a very dangerous thing indeed. That kind of love is the kind that topples empires, burns down villages, and thirsts for revenge at any cost. After all, hell hath no fury like, well, anyone scorned. But today, yes, we are talking about a woman, and her name is Grace Lusk. In 1913, Grace was a prim 31-year-old schoolteacher who had recently moved to Waukesha, Wisconsin. She was incredibly well-read, she was well-traveled, she had been to Europe a couple times, and she had a sterling reputation as both an educator and a loyal friend. She was, however, a relatively shy individual, and it seemed like Grace had given up the idea of a grand love affair a long time ago in her life. She was pretty sure she wanted to stay single and be school marmish, for lack of a better word. That is, until she met the dashing Dr. David Roberts at a party. So Dr. Roberts was not only the local veterinarian, but he was also a wealthy man who ran a dairy operation, a cow tonic business.
Go back.
Cow tonic business, which I believe was some sort of special dairy cow medication. Because again, this is 1913-ish. And he had also published a series of veterinary textbooks that had netted him the big bucks. Not to mention, he reportedly had a fine head of hair and a big, bushy mustache.
Two things I definitely look for in a man.
Don't we all? The only problem was that Dr. Roberts had a wife. Well, this was hardly an obstacle for the Randy couple who began a torrid affair. The relationship went on in secret for nearly 4 years until Grace got sick of being the side piece and began to put pressure on her beau to ditch his wife and make her the new Mrs. Dr. Roberts. Got to get that cow tonic money. Now, David Roberts was very happy to carry on and put Grace off this idea. Well, Grace wasn't having it and wrote the following letter to Mrs. Mary Roberts, who was 52 years old to Grace's 35. Grace wrote, "It has been a desire with me for a long time to tell you finally about the state of affairs between Dr. Roberts and myself. You must have known for a long time that your husband's affections have passed from you, that he cared for someone else." She went on to quote a feminist writer in saying, "In the eternal triangle, our souls require the elimination of one character."
Rough.
Unfortunately, both women desired to eliminate the other. Dr. Roberts cowardly told his wife that Grace was simply an unstable spinster with a crush. This drove Grace to madness. She appeared on the Roberts' doorstep with a gun and threatened Dr. Roberts while begging him to choose her. The not-so-good doctor called the police to escort his lover back to her boarding house. The very next day, Mrs. Mary Roberts showed up at Grace's house and demanded an explanation for her, quote, asinine performance the night before.
Wow.
Man, they do not use words the same way they used to anymore.
No.
Grace showed Mary proof of the affair. There were some letters and photos of the two of them, at which point a furious Mary called her husband and demanded that he come to Grace's boarding house to have a conversation. As Dr. Roberts approached, he heard the sound of 3 gunshots ringing out. He ran to the door, and at the top of the stairs, he found his wife in a pool of her own blood, having been shot to death by his lover. Grace had then turned the gun on herself and was bleeding from the chest as Dr. Roberts flew up the staircase. "Where is my heart?" she asked her veterinarian lover. who then pointed to his own chest. Grace then fired the gun once more into her own chest, but did not succeed in killing herself. She survived.
Oh my. 2 gunshot wounds?
2 gunshot wounds to the chest.
Whoa.
It took her nearly a year to be healed. So by the time she had healed, she went to trial where her ex-lover was the star witness against her. Dr. Roberts painted Grace as a delusional temptress who refused to leave her alone. The defendant stood up and screamed at the man she had once believed to be the love of her life. "That's not true," she screamed. "That's not true. Oh, you dog." Grace Lusk was found guilty and sentenced to 19 years in prison for the murder of her romantic rival, Mrs. Mary Roberts. Upon hearing the verdict, Spicy Grace leapt at the prosecutor and attempted to strangle him.
Honestly, this is so dramatic. She went from not wanting to ever be with someone to killing someone to try to be with this dude.
I think it was repressed. I think that she got to a certain age. I mean, we're talking about 1913 at this point. So 31 was considered a little bit over the hill. Yeah, I think at that point she was like, well, I'm going to dedicate myself to my students. New year, new me. I'm going to do this thing all on my own. And then she got a taste and she did not want to let it go. So 5 years later, the court pardoned her in 1923 due to her supposedly failing health. And she did get out and marry a brave soul named Edwin Brown, which goes to show that there really is someone for everyone. She then did pass away in 1930 at the age of 52. Speaking of marriage, that old dog, Dr. Roberts, was married a total of 4 times in his life. In December of 1948, he married his 4th wife at the age of 83.
Stop it. Was Mary number 1?
I am not entirely sure, to be honest.
Okay.
His new wife, Andy, was 33 years old. She was 50 years younger than him. The old codger boasted to the AP, "More than 50 women have told me that they loved me, but now I'll have to tell all the rest. Goodbye, girls. I'm through."
Okay, mister.
So that is the tragic tale of schoolmarm Grace Lusk, who killed her romantic rival, Mrs. Mary Roberts.
Wow, that was a real incredible, short little Valentine's Day taste.
Well, thanks so much for listening. It got real love murdery up in here. And thanks to all of you guys for giving us a shot.
To close out this Valentine's Day special, my good friend Wendy and I will be sharing a story from my podcast, Foul Play Crime Series.
Everything will be wonderful someday. These words were tattooed on an arm that was found sticking out of a garbage bag that had been dumped in a ditch, along with a number of other body parts in Clay County, Nebraska. It was December the 4th, 2017, and the police knew immediately that they had found the remains of Sydney Luth, who had been missing since November the 15th that year. So what had happened to Sydney that day, and how had she ended up here?
Let's go back to Wednesday, November the 15th, 2017. Sydney was excited. Last night she had been on a date with Audrey, a lady she met on Tinder, and they had hit it off straight away. Sydney had even sent a picture of the two of them together to her friend Brittany. Sydney applied her makeup and pulled on a cream shirt before grabbing her white Colombian brand jacket to complete her outfit. She took a quick selfie and posted it to Snapchat, saying "ready for my date," before heading out the door. Her mother, Susan, saw the message later in the evening and was excited for her daughter, sending her a quick text saying, "How come you didn't tell me you had a date?" She was glad that Sydney was getting out and meeting people, and deep down hoped that this could be the start of happier times for her daughter, who had been suffering from depression.
The next morning, Sydney failed to turn up for her shift at the local home improvement store that she worked in. Her colleagues were concerned and went to her apartment, where they found her car outside but nobody home. They contacted her mother, Susan, who lived 150 miles away. Susan was shocked to receive the call, but also had a gut feeling that something was wrong. Sydney hadn't replied to her message last night and hadn't called her today. They were very close and spoke most days, so she had already started to worry a little. Susan filed a missing persons report. Sheriff Alan J. Moore, the sheriff of Saline County, Nebraska, affidavit in court stated,
Quote, on November 16, 2017, the Lincoln Police Department received a report of a missing person. The missing person was identified as Sydney Loof, a 24-year-old female, date of birth August 21st, 1993, who had been residing in Northeast Lincoln. According to a coworker, Sydney was last seen leaving her job at Menards, located at 3500 North 27th in Lincoln, Lancaster County, Nebraska, on the evening of November 15, 2017. Sydney failed to show up for her shift on the morning of November 16, 2017. Sydney was reported missing by her mother, Susan Loof, who lives in Neely, Nebraska, at approximately 5 p.m. on November 16, 2017. End quote.
The search for Sydney began. Missing persons posters were issued, showing 3 pictures of Sydney, including the selfie taken just before she went out on her date. She was described as 5 foot 7 inches tall, 135 pounds, with blonde hair and blue eyes. Her family took to social media, begging people to come forward if they knew anything. 12 days after Sydney's disappearance, Lincoln police asked for the public's assistance. They were trying to locate 2 persons of interest: Bailey Boswell, aged 23, and Aubrey Trail, aged 51. No further information was provided. No connection to Sydney was specified. They just stated that it was part of an ongoing investigation. And then the following day, on November the 29th, Lincoln Police Department posted a picture of Sydney on their Facebook page with the words,
Quote, the investigation into the disappearance of Sydney Loof continues as investigators search various areas in Saline and Gage counties. Searches are being conducted in multiple agencies, including the Gage County Sheriff's Office, Saline County Sheriff's Office, United States Marshal's Service, Nebraska State Patrol, Lincoln Police Department, and the FBI. Investigators are searching for any evidence that may help locate Sydney. If you see law enforcement officers searching, we ask that you avoid the area to avoid disruptions to the search. Sydney's family and law enforcement are diligently working to locate her and encourage anyone with information on her whereabouts to call LPD at 402-411-6000. End quote.
In the comments under this post, there were many praising the police and supporting the family, but hidden between them were 2 posts that stood out. A lady posted, quote, the suspects posted 2 new videos, end quote, with links to the videos in question on YouTube. These videos were removed very quickly, but I did find another video by Aubrey Trail, dated November the 30th. Trail is a heavy-set man with dark hair and is wearing a black zip-up hoodie. The video is just over 9 minutes long. Here are some snippets.
I've been watching a lot of posts and comments today. So far today, from the comments, we have apparently murdered this lady. We have apparently put her into human trafficking and sold her. And not only did we do that, we used the money. We went to the casino that weekend and used the money that we sold her for. Bailey didn't drop her in a friend's house. She dropped her off at her drug dealer's house, Bailey's, according to the comments you guys are making. We've pretty much decided to turn ourselves in and see where this goes. Because now we're seeing on the news, the people of Wilbur are terrified because I guess we're guilty by association, which is fine. because I've never made an excuse for anything I've done in my life. I do what I do.
And there is a second video from both Trail and Boswell, again denying all allegations that they were involved, but admitting that Boswell was the person who went out on a date with Sydney that night. The second video is really creepy. They are sat in a car, Boswell in a black hoodie, hood up, and large sunglasses. Trail is off to the side in a black hat. Throughout the 9-minute video, Boswell does not move, just staring straight-faced into the camera.
So how did the police find a link to Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail? The FBI traced the ping from Sydney's phone to Wilbur, Nebraska, about 40 miles from Sydney's apartment. And more specifically, the ping was from the apartments where Boswell and Trail lived. Both of them had extensive criminal histories, including theft and scams, but nothing violent. When the police turned up to question them, they were nowhere to be found. But their landlady mentioned that their apartment had smelled strongly of bleach. A police warrant was obtained, and as they searched the basement apartment, they found a few unusual items. A dog leash, even though the couple did not own a dog. A sauna suit with a crotch cutout, zip ties, a hatchet, a plastic drop cloth smeared with blood, and a book on anatomy. The apartment was filthy, untidy, and cluttered. Apart from one room, which had been scrubbed clean, alarm bells were ringing. The police followed Boswell's cell phone data from the day that Sydney went missing, searching roadsides, ponds, and scrubland. It was along one of these roads the first garbage bag was found in a ditch, quickly followed by a further 12 in the surrounding area. Most of Sydney's dismembered, bruised body was recovered, apart from her upper left arm and her internal organs, which have never been found. The autopsy showed Sydney's cause of death as suffocation.
Trail said that Sydney had died during a BDSM game gone wrong, and that Boswell was not involved. Both Trail and Boswell were charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and improper disposal of human remains. Trail stood trial in June 2019. During the trial, many women testified who said that they had met Boswell on Tinder and been given money and luxury items to engage in group sex and scams with Trail and Boswell. It was like a cult. And the trial became even more bizarre when Trail rose from his seat, shouted, quote, "Sydney is innocent, I curse you all," end quote, and slit his throat with a sharpened pen. Trail survived. He also suffered 2 heart attacks and a stroke during his 3-week trial, but was finally convicted on all 3 counts and sentenced to death. This is what Trail had to say after his sentencing.
I won't say I'm sorry, as that would be an insult to you after what I've put you through, and I won't ask for forgiveness as I don't believe there is such a thing.
Boswell, whose trial took place in September 2020, was also found guilty on all 3 counts and sentenced to life imprisonment.
Thank you for listening. Tinder can be fun, but it can also be deadly. Stay alert, meet in a public place, and stay safe. And happy Valentine's Day. I hope you've enjoyed this special collaboration episode I've put together with my team. And I'd like to thank each of my podcaster friends for joining in with me and sharing their story. Love is desired, love is complicated, and sometimes love is deadly. But when you find it, and when it's true, I'll argue it's worth the journey and risk to find it. Just be cautious and be safe. All of the podcasts you heard from are listed in the show notes. Again, I'm Shane Waters from Foul Play. It's been my pleasure being your Valentine tonight.